Do you know all the ways the Ratchet you choose affects your Beyblade? Me either. So let's take a look together at how Ratchets hold everything together. At first glance, it could seem like the least important part of your Beyblade, but to put it in gaming terms, the Ratchet is like the bright glowing weak spot on a highly armored character, so protecting it is important. But the degree of importance may vary based on what your setup is. If you're running an attack setup, then your focus is applying pressure rather than resisting it, so you're less concerned about it in matchups against defensive or stamina Beyblades. But if you're one of those defense or stamina setups, you know you're going to be taking repeated hits, so keeping the Ratchet protected is more of a priority. There's an irony in this relating to other parts in your setup, but I'll get to that later. Currently, we have access to 6 different Ratchets, all of which have 2 defining features. The first is the number of notches, or protrusions, or whatever you'd like to call these parts that stick out from the Ratchet. Right now, we have Ratchets with 3, 4, or 5, but I imagine this will only expand as time goes on, whether with how many protrusions, or maybe things like how large or small each one is. The second feature is the height of the Ratchet, which is defined by a number attached to it. Currently there are 60 and 80 heights, but based on some promotional images, it looks like there will be at least 3 more heights added in the future. With these 2 features, each Ratchet can easily be referenced by the number of protrusions and the height. So a Ratchet with 5 protrusions and a 60 height would be a 560 Ratchet. So how do we decide which Ratchet is right for what setup? That's where I have to resort to some theory where others can refer to experience. The simplest idea to me is that if an attack type wants to go for burst finishes by attacking the opposing Ratchet, then you'd want lower height Ratchets. But wouldn't defense or stamina type setups want lower Ratchets as well to protect from those attacks? I could use some experienced players' insight on this aspect. Like, does it affect the center of gravity? Does it make them more stable? The only thing I can immediately think of is being higher up could allow for attacks that come from above, maybe destabilizing opposing Beyblades by knocking the blade down from above. Then what about the number of protrusions? How do those factor in? I can't remember if this came from a comment or video or a Discord conversation, but it was brought up that depending on the shape of the blade you're using, the locations of the Ratchet protrusions can help inform your decision. Basically, these are the parts that are most likely to be hit because they stick the furthest out, so you want a blade that will cover them as best as possible. If we take a blade and attach each different Ratchet and look from directly below, we can get a rough idea of how protected the protrusions are by the blade. Using Wizard Arrow as an example here, we can see that with a 480 Ratchet, there's 2 potential spots where the Ratchet is a little more exposed. When we switch to a 380 Ratchet, that's reduced to 1 spot. This made me think, well, obviously the Ratchet with less protrusions would be better. Would it ever be better the other way around? Well, messing around with some other blades showed that while still relatively protected on a Hell Scythe blade, the 4 had a slightly better positioning than the 3, which left 1 spot slightly more exposed than the others. So it's not the biggest thing here, but what I take away from it is that trial and error experimentation will be the way to find what works for each blade. And don't look for just the best Ratchet option, but also the second or third best, because if you're playing in a tournament where you bring a deck of Beyblades, you won't be able to use the same Ratchet on each setup. So knowing what can go where and still work well enough will be valuable. The last aspect I want to look into is how Ratchets interact with bits. And this is where the irony I mentioned earlier comes in. Among all the bits currently available, the shaft will be one of 2 types, thick or thin. The thicker bits make the Ratchet significantly harder to remove while attached. This sounds like an easy choice for defensive or stamina builds, right? Except that the thicker bits are so far all on what would be considered attack type bits, not meant for long duration battles. The closest that we would have is the point bit from the newer Leon Claw if you're launching it perfectly onto the rounded portion in the center. I can only guess this is a balancing choice to both prevent defense and stamina types from being too hard to burst and also preventing attack types from bursting themselves from their attacks. So where does that leave me on understanding how Ratchets affect setups and match outcomes? It feels like while there may be more to consider than I initially expected, I'm also still not confident on why Ratchets with more height would be desirable over lower height ones. And as I've said before, there's still so much I don't know, but that's part of the fun. And the more experienced players have been so helpful on pointing me in the right direction and correcting anything I got wrong or missed, so I'm thankful for that. I'm going to keep having fun learning, and I hope the same for you. So where does that leave me on understanding how ratchets affect setups and match outcomes? It feels like while there may be more to consider than I initially expected, I'm still not confident on why ratchets with more height would be desirable over lower height ones. As I've said before, there's still so much I don't know, and that's part of the fun. And the more experienced players have been so helpful in pointing me in the right direction and correcting anything I get wrong or missed. So I'm thankful for that. And I'm going to keep having fun learning, and I hope you can do the same.